Luke tells us that Jesus, being filled with the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being tempted for 40 days by the devil. Satan brought him to Jerusalem, set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, then throw yourself down from here, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge over you to keep you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered and said to him, "It has been said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God." Now when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. It's important to understand that Satan, as god of this world and prince of the power of the air, had the authority to give Jesus the earthly kingdoms, and Jesus didn't question that. Now, have you ever wondered where this personal encounter between Jesus and Satan actually took place? So we're going to consider 3 possible locations, and each has its certain arguments in its favour. So you be the judge. Firstly, let's go to the traditional place for this meeting, in fact where most scholars think it took place. So here we are at the southwest corner of the temple, positioned on the roof of the royal portico, one of the most beautiful and massive buildings in the ancient Near East. This was where the Sanhedrin conducted their legal affairs, where you could purchase a sacrifice or change your money to the temple currency. It was a vast, ornate and fabulous public concourse. It was also where Jesus purged the money changers and provided access from the south of the city, Lower Jerusalem. The historian Josephus provides an interesting description. He says, "This cloister deserves to be mentioned better than any other under the sun, for while the valley was very deep and its bottom could not be seen, even if you looked from above into the depth, this farther vastly high elevation of the cloister stood upon that height, insomuch that if anyone looked down from the top of the battlements, or down both these altitudes, he would be giddy, while his sight could not reach to such an immense depth." So if you stood on this point at that time, you'd be looking south and west towards the 2 superpowers of that age, which were Egypt and Rome. So this is certainly a strong candidate for Satan to be able to offer the kingdoms of the world to Jesus. The corner of the roof here was also the exact place the priest sounded the shofar to announce the onset of Shabbat. It was directly above what was probably the busiest junction in Jerusalem too. Think of Times Square in New York today, or the middle of London Bridge. The best place to advertise and announce yourself if that was the motivation. Okay, so that's our first candidate. Let's look at the second candidate. Let's move east and consider the southeast corner of the royal portico. From this point to the floor of the Kidron Valley was a vertical drop of some 300 feet. This is worth considering as it's the greatest elevation from temple to ground level of our 3 possible locations. It's an interesting candidate for the encounter between Jesus and Satan because it's also the nearest point of the temple to the summit of Olivet, where Jesus would later ascend to heaven, and one day in the future to where he will return in exactly the same place, although Satan wouldn't know that. Remember that Satan is neither omnipresent nor omniscient. What I mean by that is he can only be in one place at one time, and he doesn't know everything, although he'd like you to think he does. Although it has its merits, I think this is probably the least likely location for the encounter. Finally, let's move to the sanctuary itself. So why should we consider this as a potential location? Well, I'm going to be controversial, and I'm going to go against the traditional view and pin my choice here. Let me explain why. This was the holiest place. The priest didn't consider the royal portico as being on holy ground. That was the area around the sanctuary itself, marked out by a low wall within which Gentiles were not permitted to enter on pain of death. It was also the most ornate position. Imagine the sanctuary covered in plates of solid gold, beautifully cut and jointed Jerusalem limestone, and the altar and the various gateways that gave access to the courts. Now, while all that's interesting, for me though, there's one decisive factor, and that's what Matthew tells us. And it's always helpful to compare the different perspectives of Jesus' ministry from different Gospels. And what Matthew says is that the devil took Jesus to the holy city, to Jerusalem, and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. So what was the highest point? Well, it was the roof of the sanctuary, and this stood head and shoulders above the whole of the temple complex, around 120 feet above the top of the royal portico and 170 feet above the place of the sacrifice below. It was visible from miles away, its gold-clad walls reflecting the sun, in fact. The view from the roof here would have been absolutely stunning, and I hope you get a sense of it from our model, looking over the parapet of gold and downwards at the place of sacrifice, where the people brought their offerings to the priests, the lambs and the doves, for slaughter. But now, let's turn in the opposite direction, away from the ritual, the legalistic practices of the Mosaic law, and over towards the western edge of the city, some 500 or 600 yards away, to a bleak hillside, Golgotha, Calvary, just outside the city walls. Jesus knew his only path was through a Roman cross, and there would be no compromise, no shortcuts, no easy road to establish his Father's kingdom on earth. Now, if this is true, and this is in fact the location of the temptation of Christ, then this would be the only occasion that Jesus came in person into the sanctuary itself. We know later, for example, that he came into the courts, and we've dealt with that teaching on my talk on the Omega programme and the spine of biblical prophecy. So there you have it, 3 possibilities, 3 possible locations. Where do you think the temptation happened? And when you're next tempted, consider that Jesus was tempted on all points as we are, yet he never sinned. He knew the only way was through the cross. That was his path, and it's ours too. He's fashioned a cross for each of us, and there is no other way to follow him. I'll see you soon with another glimpse from Jerusalem.